Hey, my name is Sasha Strong, and I'm an LGBTQ entrepreneur. I am a psychotherapist in private practice in Portland, Oregon, and I also offer some trainings. I'm just really thrilled to be able to use my positionality as a non-binary person to help other folks in the trans and gender nonconforming and queer communities find healing, growth, and resilience.
Hello, Out Bosses. Rhodes Perry here, and welcome to this week's episode of The Out Entrepreneur, a weekly podcast where I get to interview today's most inspiring LGBTQ bosses crushing it in business. On this week's show, I'm really excited to introduce you all to a friend and a fellow Portland resident, Sasha Strong. So, Sasha, welcome to the show. I would love to just give a little bit of background to our audience about who you are and what you do. So for those not familiar with Sasha's work, they are a non-binary psychotherapist and founder of Brilliancy Counseling, a private practice based out of Portland, Oregon, and online. Sasha's practice blends their lived experience and training to help their clients find brilliant sanity, unleashing their innate wisdom and dignity. Sasha also offers trainings in non-binary and transgender cultural competency for counselors, therapists, and other health professionals. Sasha, I know that this has been an interview that we've had on the radar for a while, so I'm glad that it's happening. And I was hoping that you could kick off the conversation by taking just a few moments to share more about your origin story and starting your own private psychotherapy practice. So, specifically just share a bit about your professional background and why you decided to break out on your own.
Sure. I'm really happy to be here too, Rhodes. And I'm glad we were able to make the time and line things up. I know it's been a logistically interesting time all around for the past several months. In terms of my private practice and how I got there, it's, I think a lot of therapists like me came to this profession with a sense of wanting to help other people. And having gotten a lot of benefit from my own therapy and different kinds of healing work that I've done in the past, I decided to get into the profession. And I've found that for me, it's incredibly enriching to be able to work with people, particularly people in my community in terms of gender and queer spaces. Private practice is interesting because the setup with psychotherapy is that mostly people can either work in an agency, like a publicly funded situation. People often work in educational settings, either as instructors or doing like school counseling or university counseling clinic practice. And sometimes people end up working in group practices. And then there's private practice, which is typically, at least in my case right now, I'm a solo practitioner. I do some collaborative work with my partner in real life, Caden Wintercorn. But mostly you're on your own. So I think like a lot of entrepreneurs, I get a lot of value out of being able to make my own decisions and not having to deal with a lot of bureaucracy or having other people breathe down my neck. And then, when things aren't going well, I know exactly who's to blame in terms of decisions. Yeah. So for me, there's something really fulfilling about having that clear connection between decision and responsibility. And I really just like the freedom and creativity that a solo private practice offers. I'm not sure that I'll be working in this particular way for the rest of my career, but for now, it feels really good.
Thank you for that. I appreciate just kind of the breakdown of where psychotherapists typically are found, when not kind of having their own private practices. And so much of what you've shared about why you decided to go out on your own, I'm sure it definitely resonates with me, and I'm sure it resonates with a lot of our listeners about just the pieces of freedom, the autonomy of, decision-making, the responsibility, that comes along with that, which is tricky sometimes when things don't always go in the direction of massive success right away. And, at the end of the day, you're able to steer your practice in the direction you want to go. And on that, I wanted to touch on something that I read in your bio, which is that you help your clients find brilliant sanity that helps them unleash their innate wisdom and dignity. So share with us more about what this means to you, and maybe, talk about a bit about the transformation that your clients go through when working with you.
Well, in terms of the notion of brilliant sanity, I think that there are a lot of problems in some kind of clinical training for counseling or psychotherapy or social work or psychology, clinical psychology, in that a lot of people get trained to pathologize people and to identify problems and sort of treat problems rather than working with people. But, both my sort of my training and my personal bias around therapy, and then also what is borne out in the research, is that actually like the quality of the relationship is really positive, and helping clients mobilize positive things that are already going on in their life really helps too. So in general, I guess I really try to recognize the goodness that's already happening in people. And I try to go along with that rather than viewing people as diagnoses to be treated in some kind of like formalized treatment plan. And I think a lot of counselors do that. But my personal clinical training really focused a lot on that. My master's degree was in contemplative psychotherapy, which sort of merges Buddhist psychology. That was one of the disciplines I used to contact my own sanity and to learn to test all of my emotions and to find out something beneath thoughts, so that rather than just thinking I am who I think I am, realize there's something else going on than just the story. And so there's a way that training helps me to recognize the sanity and the wisdom and the organic growth that's available, maybe just out of reach of the client's storyline that causes suffering for them, or just beneath the problem, there's this big foundation of goodness happening. So how can we rest in that and trust that? And then sometimes the problems can kind of resolve on their own. So that's been something that I've found personally helpful. And then in terms of my clinical work, I think that everyone's story is different. All clients have a very different story because everybody's really individual. And, sometimes people make really dramatic transformations, and other times it takes a longer time because I think the problems that they're working with sometimes are just more deeply entrenched, So it's hard for me to say in a categorical way what kinds of transformations people come to, but in general, I hope that, people leave, when they do leave, our sessions or our course of treatment, as they say in the profession, that they feel that they've been able to befriend themselves in their experience more, and they feel more confidence in their state of mind, no matter what's going on.
Yeah, I really like that. Just the concept of befriending yourself, being kind and gentle to yourself. I also appreciate what you're saying about your approach is one that's holistic, and that you're seeing someone that you're working with as a complete person and not just some kind of diagnosis, as you said, kind of traditionally in the field of treating a problem that a person has, and kind of isolating that from everything else that's going on in their lives. And kind of also talking about like your approach of infusing Buddhism into the work that you're doing. So it's clear that you've blended your lived experiences and your professional background to develop a unique approach to psychotherapy. So talk with us just a little bit more about how your approach allows you to stand out among other folks in your space. Is what you're doing something that is unique amongst other psychotherapists, or are there other folks kind of taking similar blended practices to really work holistically with the clients that they work with every day? It's
a complicated answer. I'm happy to give it. On one hand, and so some more about my background. I'm also a PhD candidate in an interdisciplinary doctoral program that blends spirituality and psychology. It's called East-West Psychology, this particular degree. And so I'm also going to bring more of the kind of research perspectives on psychotherapy, and particularly on psychotherapy integration and the common factors is a little bit of what informs what I'm going to say. So first off, it turns out that most therapists in actual private practice develop their own eclectic set of techniques and theoretical orientations. So on one hand, I can't say that what I'm doing is particularly unique in that everybody's doing something unique, right? And in a sense, that's to be encouraged because, different people, different clients respond to different kinds of tools and frameworks differently. And so it's really good to be a generalist and have a lot of different ways to help people, right? So it's good to have, and there are like 200 or 400 or more different individual psychotherapy modalities, right? So it's good to have a kind of a toolkit to help people work with different kinds of problems because different people respond differently to different things. So that said, I think that there are things that are unique about what I'm doing. particularly in terms of working with trans and gender nonconforming folks. I'm not aware of anybody who has the kind of training that I do, who has a specialty in working with the trans and GNC community. And so in that regard, I think it is kind of unique. You know, my background, my clinical training has a lot of group psychotherapy training, and I offer a couple of groups for gender support here in Portland. And, you know, now we're doing them online, but before that we were doing them in person. The possibilities, or maybe the power of the group for trans and gender nonconforming folks is really impressive, because there's such a need to be with other people who have a shared experience of privilege and oppression, and of the complicated points of gender identity and transition and just navigating cis heteropatriarchy, that those groups do something that are, I wouldn't say that it's impossible to do in individual therapy, but it's just so much more creative and effective, because it creates an intentional space for people to talk about the kinds of difficulties that they experience together and hear a diversity of voices, and build together kind of practical frameworks for resistance and resilience. And as well as just like share sort of technical details about medical transition related points. And so it's this really interesting way that my clinical training in group therapy ends up landing in a powerful way now, because there aren't a lot of groups available, for example, in Portland, that are like closed psychotherapy groups. There are a few other people offering those things, but and of course I don't know what they do in those groups because I haven't participated in them. So another way of answering your question is, well, maybe, but I don't know, because I don't know what everybody else does in their office. You know?
That's taking a very humble approach to answering the question. I mean, it's clear like you're offering so much value, and in particular for trans and non-binary folks. And I wanted to, kind of continue on that topic and just note, for folks that may not be as familiar with trans and non-binary communities, historically the mental health community has failed to support the mental health and well-being of trans and non-binary people over the course of history, right? So what are you doing in your practice, in addition to the groups, the clinical groups that you're providing, to disrupt these past harms? And in particular, what support are you providing fellow mental health practitioners to know better so that they can do better when engaging with trans and non-binary people?
Well, let's see. So one thing I do is, again, with my individual clients, I think that both there are a lot of historical harms based on like gatekeeping and punishing and pathologizing trans and gender nonconforming folks, for sure, stretching decades, maybe longer into history. I mean, probably decades, just because before that it was a medical thing, like the mental health field per se has only existed for about 100 years. So bringing a lens, an anti-oppression lens into my individual work, and sometimes explaining to people, for example, the reason you're depressed in part isn't because there's a problem with you. It's because you have to navigate oppression every day. It's because you're in an oppressive society that makes you feel bad about yourself. And to some degree, you've internalized those attitudes, and that might be contributing to your depression, but that doesn't make it your fault. Right. So there's a really important way that working with clients, helping them to identify the otherwise invisible systems of oppression and trans hostility, cis heteropatriarchy, that normalize a particular way of being human, and helping them recognize that actually they can establish their own narratives and sources of value and sense of community. And also to cope with the fact that it's always going to be hard. I mean, it's getting better, but it's still rough to be trans, So just acknowledging it and in a sense, helping people build tools and skills for navigating those realities and for making change in their turn too. Yeah. And then in terms of, and then I think the other question you asked was about helping other mental health professionals. Is that right?
Yes.
Or other professionals. Yeah. So in terms of helping other mental health professionals, there are a couple of things that I do, maybe 3 things. One is I try to participate in professional groups that center trans and gender nonconforming experience or queer experience. I'm the outgoing secretary of the Oregon Association for LGBT Issues in Counseling, So trying to establish more of a professional community in Oregon and Southwest Washington has been something we've been doing with that organization. I've been trying to connect and build more of a network with professionals because, both it's important to have people to refer clients to, and it's important as a helping professional to have a resilient social network of people who you can talk with and kind of do problem solving with, because it's an important part of self-care and responding to community needs. A third thing that I do when the occasion arises is I will consult with people who have questions about working with trans and gender nonconforming folks. So sometimes other practitioners have contacted me and we've spent an hour or so on the phone, maybe 2 hours, talking about where they're at in their practice and what they might be able to do to help particular clients or to improve their skills overall. And I also offer some trainings for health professionals to increase their trans and non-binary genderqueer cultural competency. And I think that that's something that I'm hoping to grow more in my practice. It's just been a lot to juggle with the dissertation and private practice and COVID and all this stuff. But that's definitely something on my horizon, is to add to my offerings in terms of educating other professionals, both on kind of general trans cultural competency issues and specifically non-binary and genderqueer competency, because there's such a paucity of good information and training for people.
Yeah. It's so powerful what you're doing, both with the folks that you're working with, just normalizing, maybe not normalizing, reminding trans, non-binary folks that you're working with about kind of the day-to-day world that we live in, a world that isn't necessarily built for us, or like built with regard to how to include people who see gender in a way more nuanced way than kind of thinking about it on binary terms. And that's got to be really empowering to, as you work with your clients, watching their progress of like acknowledging like, I live in this world, it's challenging, and I have all these survival and resiliency strategies and tools, and, being able to process that with you in a space. I mean, that sets you apart for sure from other folks doing the work that you do. And also, by being engaged with professional associations, your willingness to consult with other professionals in your space on how they could be more inclusive to trans and non-binary people, the trainings that you're eventually going to offer, once we survive this really challenging time, or, even during it. That's such value, that you're adding to the field, being a thought leader in many respects when it comes to really building a gender inclusive practice is commendable. And I thank you for doing that. I wanted to ask you, as you kind of brought up the world that we find ourselves in, running a business, running a private practice, in kind of, pre-COVID days, that's hard enough. It requires so much of us. So I'm wondering, from, in your own words, what drives you to continually show up day after day to do the work that you do? What's your why? Why do you, what makes your heart sing when you do this work? Just to remind us all of why we continue to build the businesses that we're building.
I mean, I think I do it for love. Like I find I'm able to find something to love in all my clients and in all my groups, so that makes it easy, because for me, showing up for somebody else to support them is for me personally an inherently meaningful act, and it's something that I genuinely enjoy doing. Yeah. From one of the hardest shifts that happened with COVID was having to move all my therapy work online, which I hadn't done much of before. I'd occasionally done sessions with people when they were like out of town, but I hadn't, it forced, entire professions to switch to a really different format, and therapy is one of them. And so what has been hard about that shift is that I've had to make an adjustment for how I find nourishment in the therapy session. It used to be that just by seeing my clients face to face and helping them with their problems and being able to show up as an authentic, responsive, interested human being, that itself wasn't a really strong energizing factor. And it still is, but there's so much less available in terms of the different sensory channels. Now we're really compressed to like video and audio and a little like mirror neuron proprioception of sorts. but I've had to kind of lean into my self-care strategies in a different way and adapt new ones, right? Because whatever we were doing before COVID and before this kind of rolling lockdown, social distancing time, so many people have really had to change and adapt how they take care of themselves to do things that are more indoors and more socially isolated. So something I really noticed is that for me, it's easy to keep going, but it's a question of how do I sort of adjust my ship to work with really different prevailing conditions. How do I adjust my rigging or whatever? I mean, this is goofy because I've never actually sailed a boat, right? So it's a bad metaphor that I don't have a lot of handle on, but it's a little bit like that. Is I'm still able to continue with the same mission, but I need to find different ways of resting and kind of refilling my own fuel tank, so to speak, and also helping clients do that in their own lives too. So it's been a big adjustment for everybody.
Yeah. I really appreciate what you're saying. And, you're speaking my language when you say, you do this work for love. So much of what I do is about building belonging, in the work that we do. And it's heart-centered, right? And so much of what you're providing for your clients is that space, one, like a belonging space, and finding, I really like what you said about finding nourishment in the work and how that's become more complicated with the world that we find ourselves in, right? There's something that is lost, with kind of these virtual connections where we don't energetically feel in the same way. And yet you're finding ways to work around that. While not perfect, you're experimenting like a lot of us. So I wanted to kind of stay on this thread of the world we find ourselves in and shift to the large scale racial justice uprisings that are happening in this country and even globally, right? And so that is also impacting the way that we're working and the way that we think about how we're building our businesses, where we're finding, racism inside of ourselves and how we've been cultured, but also, systemically in the systems that we find ourselves working in. And, recognizing that your practice helps improve your clients' mental health and well-being. How have the large-scale racial justice uprisings impacted your work in particular?
I would say that for me personally, as a white person and as a professional trying to help people, and also as, fundamentally, like my politics are pretty radical, pretty leftist. I'm usually polite. I don't try to get into fights with other people about their political positions. Yeah. So I'm not as particularly outspoken, sort of radical, but I don't know. To other people, I probably look like a progressive. I'm not sure, And it's easier for me to critique existing structures than to place myself squarely in any single political movement or position, And I think that there are ways that my politics are focused on liberation and equity. That's both from my, maybe my character and my value set, and also my analysis of privilege and oppression, of capitalism and capitalism as opposed to business. It's interesting to be in private practice and to be pro small business and sort of anti-capitalist, and then to be pro, not actually pro government, but also oh, well, the alternative is dysfunctional kleptocracy. Yes, I'd rather have a functioning government, even if it's relatively conservative compared to my values stance. So then to actually respond to your question, that's all the preface, right? In terms of the impact of the racial justice uprisings on my personal practice, it has really put me in a position of trying to figure out my way forward as an ally and aspiring ally of racialized people who are oppressed on that basis, to figure out what I need to do to actually become more culturally competent than I am. I think I have a pretty good analysis of race and oppression, but my actual cultural competency as a psychotherapist, I don't think is that good. I'm definitely not overtly racist, but there are probably plenty of ways that I'm not anti-racist. So one thing I did is I got involved in a racial justice reading group with some friends of mine. a friend of mine put it together, and we've been meeting on Zoom every other week. And right now we're reading Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is both easy to read and really solid and incisive in terms of its analysis, I think, and gives me more clarity around how my own thinking has been obfuscated as a white person living in, and here's a term I'll use in a kind of pejorative way, living in like liberal democratic like storyline or narrative politically, is that there's not a clear analysis of race and racism and equity work in that political paradigm. But I haven't spent enough time in other circles where there's shared talk of racial liberation that white people can participate in without getting in the way, and without, for example, having white fragility become a problem and things like that. So in a sense, I think that these racial justice uprisings have clarified and problematized my own position. Like it's clearer and clearer that I can't sort of blithely ignore it. And it also points out how much work I have to do in order to get to a point where I feel like I'm more competent and I can actually be of help in an active way, rather than trying to be helpful but then doing harm, which is something that I'd rather avoid doing if I can. And, in terms of my clients, it affects everybody differently, but, most of my clients are white people. In part, that's because there are a whole lot of white people in Portland, Oregon. And in part, it's because I haven't sought to create a racially diverse client base because of what I perceive as my own shortcomings in terms of being a multiculturally or race competent therapist. As I've actually I've not tried to put myself out there because I'm not quite sure of my own abilities yet.
Yeah. I really appreciate your honesty in your response and also the honest look at yourself, and like for me and many white people, of like really acknowledging the internalized racism that exists, that kind of many of us have grown up in the United States, and also, that honest acknowledgement about where your learning curves still are and your commitment, and and just kind of sharing the reading group that you're in and having dialogue with other white folks doing the work, willing to kind of say, okay, like I've got learning to do, and this is where I'm at, and I can be honest about that, and I know I have a better sense of where I need to be. And in thinking about that in your field, in your work, also being honest about who you can serve and where you can be eventually, and and having some accountability to getting there. I think that's so key. And I want to kind of continue with this topic and thinking about like the role that we play. And I love that you were talking about earlier about like your politics of being anti-capitalist yet being a small business owner, and kind of just that interesting tightrope that you walk on. And it definitely resonates with me in a number of ways of my commitments to social justice and trying to make that live in my business, which is operating in a capitalistic society. So all of that, I'm wondering, from your perspective, knowing this audience is largely composed of LGBT business owners, what can we be playing as business owners to center racial justice in our workplace, in our culture, in our everyday practices, even if it is, to kind of de-educate, to re-educate, what are some things that come to mind for you or that you're trying to kind of infuse in your own work?
Well, I'm happy to speculate within the constraints of my expertise. The first thing that I would say is that the best people to ask about that are probably people of color and people of other, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Mm-hmm. My opinion is those are probably the best people to look to. And I would also say that different strategies and tactics really depend on the specific contexts we find ourselves in. A solo entrepreneur is going to be in a very different space than somebody who is the head of a medium-sized business, who's going to be in a really different space from somebody who's in middle management at a large business. I think that to kind of borrow a little bit from a social work theory, they talk about levels of social analysis at the micro, meso, and macro levels. And I think that looking at those same levels of like in the micro, like, oh, in this room, in this workplace, in my thoughts, how can I be anti-racist? How can we practice anti-racism in our policies and in our ideas? you know. And then at the meso level, let's say, oh, in our work group, in my department, in my professional community, or in my company, how can we, in an interior way, or in close connection with things that are kind of at our level, how can we influence practices and procedures so that there is more equity? Equity here meaning like not just equality, but actually addressing the ways that systems of oppression have for a long time created unequal conditions for different people, based in this case on race, but there are other social identity factors that also get used to carve up and oppress various people, of course, right? And then at the macro level, how can I, or how can we, or how can our company have a bigger impact on, for example, national policy or large scale change? So that's some finger painting for you, Rose. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. No, I think it's great. And I think it's great. And I think it's important for many of us to really look at our businesses, look at our practices, look what's within reach. And I really appreciate just kind of thinking about that individual level, kind of the meso level, as you say, just kind of like looking around at your team of people, and then kind of more macro, like where your company sits in kind of this global world that we find ourselves in. I don't want to miss out on this question, which is one of my favorites, which is, when you think about your lived experiences, the good and the bad, kind of neutral things that may have happened to you as being a member of kind of our broader rainbow family, what to you stands out as a superpower that was gleaned from those experiences that allows you to do your best work, to have a business that, you are providing a tremendous value add to the people that you serve?
I mean, honestly, for me, just feeling like I'm a member of a community at all, Part of my experience as a non-binary person, a genderqueer, gender fluid person, was of not having language or any kind of self-understanding or any clear direction to go on in terms of gender. And so I'm 39. It's 2020 and I'm 39. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in the Midwest, and there was almost zero representation of non-binary people. I guess Pat from Saturday Night Live is the only clear example that comes to me, who was, of course, derided and shamed, right?
Yeah.
And then, almost all representations of trans people were as kind of like murderous, pathological buffoons or freaks, So there was no positive representation. Have you seen Disclosure?
I have.
Fantastic. And like chilling and like good, really good to see so many people taking control over the video narrative. Like that feels really good to me. But it's also like a really good explanation of like where so many of us got these painful ideas about who trans people are and who gender nonconforming people are. So these media tropes, I think, really poisoned me against myself for a long time, and also made it, because my own gender position was incomprehensible to me for lack of community and for lack of language. I didn't really start to get a handle on my gender position until I was in my 30s. I went to this conference in 2013 in Denver called Gold Rush, put on by the Gender Identity Center of Colorado. And I went when I was in the last year of my master's program. I for the first time, I met trans people in an environment that was set up for trans people and for health professionals who wanted to help trans people. And I had already done some of my own queer identity work, like sexuality and like affective attraction wise. This was my first time in a trans space. And I remember hearing Beat Gorski, who was another student or had recently graduated from my university in their own master's program. And I apologize, I don't know what pronouns Beat is using nowadays, but Beat presented on like helping non-binary and gender non-conforming youth at this conference. And like, I was like, holy shit, that's me. It was amazing after such a long time to actually be like, oh, right, that is what that person is talking about. That's what I am in some way. And it remained nebulous. But then when I went to some other gender conferences later, specifically Gender Odyssey in Seattle. I don't remember what year that was, but then being in rooms with other trans and gender nonconforming folks who were putting on workshops and doing community support, and then feeling like, oh, right, I actually do belong. Like there is a space of people like me. And it was basically my first time understanding that and experiencing that. So, and of course, nowadays kids are growing up and they have the internet, so they have the language, and these things are entering into the common language. Hopefully my generation or our generation will be the last one to have had to grown up in a way that was like linguistically benighted, linguistically absent. Like at least it's possible to have words for yourself now as a trans and gender nonconforming teen, even if your hometown is terrible and your parents are terrible, you can at least have language for yourself. I didn't even have language, so getting that experience of belonging and recognizing that kind of experience is also something that's so precious for anyone, and being able to internalize that sense of belonging within myself and know that I can carry it forward in my life makes it so that it's something that I both understand the importance of in terms of creating for my clients and supporting them to create in their lives. And it's, in a sense, the image that comes to mind is like passing the torch, or even not passing literally the torch, but the flame on the torch. I can pass that flame on to someone else, and my own torch stays lit. So it feels like that.
That's so beautiful. The power of community, and I love that you state that as being a superpower for you that allows you to stand out, and the work that you're doing is huge. And so much of what you shared totally resonates with me because, I am 40, so it's not bad. I actually like it this decade. Some hope for you for your next birthday. But I grew up in the 80s and 90s too, with, similar in the Southeast in Florida. And wow, it's, the first, just as you were sharing kind of the first time you went to Gold Rush, a trans and non-binary conference, and to see so many people, that have similar, not the same, but similar experiences of growing up in a binary world and trying to make sense of that, and trying to even have the language, right? And that was just so inaccessible, as a young person. And with the internet and the way that we can share information now gives me, as you shared, so much hope for future generations to have a way of defining gender in a authentic, self-determined fashion is awesome. And I think the future of the world, is going to be increasingly non-binary, and we know that that's what's happening in the workplace. So I think more stories like the story that you just shared will give even more people maybe the permission, or maybe the confidence, or just the platform to get their stories out as well of what life was like, pre-internet and where we find ourselves now. But to really go back to what you said about community being that superpower is so key, not just for trans and non-binary people, but for everyone listening to this show, LGBT people, folks in the rainbow family, our allies. This is one of the things that makes us powerful. And, I like that reminder. So thank you, Sasha. I really appreciate that. My last question for you before we learn about where we can find you online is just thinking about that younger generation, or folks that are aspiring to take that entrepreneurial leap, who are LGBTQ. What advice would you give them, as they're thinking about, is this for me? Is it not? Should I do it? Should I not? The world is scary. Not sure this is the right time. What would you say to them?
On one hand, there's no time like the present. And then again, if you look at the present and our current historical situation, boy, there's really no time like the present. I think that here are the important factors to consider in taking the entrepreneurial leap. I think one important factor to consider is sound financial planning, and making sure you have ideally 6 months of savings, so that you're not feeling like you're in a do or die situation. I think that really helps to make sound decisions, because when you're financially stressed, it's easy to make emotional decisions rather than measured business decisions. I know that's not always within people's reach, but it's, the more savings you have, the better, I think. I think that there's a lot of potential for having one's own livelihood and that being a source of empowerment and community resilience. At the same time, capitalism is really rough. It is unforgiving. And that doesn't mean that you can't do it or that people shouldn't do it, but it just means knowing that if you try something and it doesn't work, that's not a reflection on you, and it's not even necessarily a reflection that it was a bad idea. It just might not have been the right time, or maybe the marketing wasn't quite right, or maybe it wasn't the right audience. There's so many things that can not quite link up, but that doesn't mean that the whole thing was worthless. And it certainly doesn't mean that, the entrepreneur is worthless or shouldn't be being an entrepreneur. And I think another really important thing is getting mentorship. I worked with a SCORE mentor. SCORE is a nationwide free service that pairs entrepreneurs with mentors. That's kind of subsidized, I think, the Small Business Administration, but that's a really cool resource. And having somebody just to do a little hand-holding and advice giving was really helpful for me. Also talking to other people who were in my line of work and asking them what they did to make their business a success was really helpful for me. I interviewed 3 or 4 people that way at various points. And then just, kind of sticking with it and being willing to build out the necessary pieces. Psychotherapy, for example, except the degree, is a pretty low overhead profession. You just need office space and, a web presence and some insurance coverage, and then you're basically good to go. It's really different from other kinds of business where you have inventory to manage, lots of employees to deal with, intense regulation, stuff like that. So I think that all of that said, if you are personally if your experience aligns with a classical entrepreneur character, which is you don't like other people telling you what to do, you like taking risks, you don't mind working hard, and you're really stubborn, then I'd say it's a great choice.
The true entrepreneur profile, the Cliff Notes version. I love it. I think it's great. I think what you offered here was an incredibly thorough response. And, it touches on advice that, almost 200 other entrepreneurs have shared in a really thorough way. So if you're thinking about it, these are really important factors. And, if there is that fire in your belly and you feel like this is the right time, you've been able to test out an idea, and you've got the right marketing, a business is a really good idea and some good marketing, and then hoping that your ideal client finds you. So those are some really important things to think through. So Sasha, we're at the end of our time together. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I want to make sure that folks who are interested in the work that you're doing know where to find you. So where's the best place to find you online?
At my private practice website, it's brilliancycounseling.com. And brilliancy is spelled just like brilliance, but with a Y instead of an E. And then counseling is spelled in the American way with just one L. Brilliancycounseling.com.
I love it. It's a beautiful website. I get to explore it today. So well done there. And we'll be sure to include that link in our show notes. So Sasha, again, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and just for being here today for so many LGBT bosses. And for everyone who's tuned in to today's episode, thank you so much. It's always a privilege connecting with you and amazing LGBT entrepreneurs like Sasha. So again, for details from today's conversation, you can go over to outentrepreneur.com and find all of the good stuff there. You can also expect another podcast episode next Tuesday, every Tuesday morning. So I'm excited that you are making the show a part of your weekly schedule. And as always, party note, keep showing up as authentically as you want. And I will see you again next Tuesday. Thank you.